In the summer of 1998, newlyweds Ethan and Clara Thompson vanished without a trace in California's Sequoia National Forest. Their car was found abandoned, but they had simply disappeared into the ancient wilderness. For 10 years, the case remained cold, haunting FBI agent Thomas Harris, who couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister lurked beneath the surface. Then, a single photograph changed everything, revealing secrets buried deep in the forest floor and unleashing a horror that had been growing in the darkness for decades. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The morning of June 15th, 1998, dawned crisp and golden across the towering sequoias of California's most ancient forest. Ethan Thompson adjusted his new wedding ring nervously as he loaded their camping gear into the back of his blue Honda Civic, the metal band still foreign against his calloused carpenter's fingers. The early summer air carried the scent of pine needles and morning dew, a fragrance that seemed to promise adventure and new beginnings. Clara emerged from their motel room, her auburn hair catching the first rays of sunlight like spun copper, wearing the flannel shirt he had given her for Christmas, now their lucky camping shirt. Her green eyes sparkled with the excitement of a woman who had waited 26 years to find her soulmate, and was now embarking on the honeymoon she had dreamed of since childhood. Their silver Honda gleamed in the parking lot of the Sequoia Lodge, packed with enough supplies for a week of wilderness exploration. Clara had meticulously organized everything in color-coded stuff sacks, her teacher's precision evident in every folded item. Ethan carried their new Polaroid camera, a wedding gift from Clara's sister, its weight solid and reassuring in his hands. The camera would capture their first adventures as husband and wife, creating instant memories to share with family back in Ohio. They had planned this trip for months, poring over trail maps spread across their kitchen table, marking potential campsites with red ink, dreaming of the photographs they would take among the giant trees. The drive into Sequoia National Park took them along winding mountain roads, where the asphalt seemed to disappear into walls of green. Clara pressed her face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she marveled at trees that had been growing since before Christ walked the earth. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white from the steep drops that yawned beside the narrow road, but his nervousness melted away each time Clara reached over to squeeze his arm, her touch warm and grounding. The radio crackled with static as they climbed higher, the outside world growing more distant with each mile. By afternoon, they had reached the trailhead at Morro Rock, where their Honda sat among a handful of other vehicles in the gravel parking area. The summer heat had given way to the cool shadows of the forest canopy, and Clara shivered as she pulled on her backpack, the straps settling into grooves her shoulders would soon learn by heart. Ethan checked their map one final time, his finger tracing the dotted line that marked their planned route to a backcountry campsite 6 miles into the wilderness. The trail stretched ahead of them like a promise, disappearing around a bend marked by a massive fallen sequoia that formed a natural bridge. Their boots crunched on the needle-strewn path as they began their hike, Clara's smaller footprints following Ethan's steady stride. The forest around them breathed with ancient life, shafts of golden sunlight piercing the canopy to illuminate patches of ferns and wildflowers. They stopped frequently those first few hours, Clara insisting on photographs of everything from unusual rock formations to particularly majestic trees, the Polaroid camera clicking and whirring as it produced its square memories. In one photograph, they stood together beside a sequoia so vast that, holding hands, they could not reach even a quarter of the way around its base. Clara's laugh echoed through the woods as Ethan struggled to balance the camera on a fallen log for a self-timed shot, running back to pose just as the shutter clicked. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop, and long shadows stretched across the forest floor like dark fingers. They had been hiking for nearly 5 hours, their water bottles growing lighter with each mile, when they reached what appeared to be a junction in the trail. Ethan consulted the map again, his brow furrowed as he tried to match the terrain around them with the topographic lines on paper. The official trail should have continued straight ahead, but a smaller path branched off to the right, disappearing into a grove of younger trees. Clara pointed to a wooden post that might once have held trail markers, though any signs had long since fallen away or been removed. The decision to take the smaller path would haunt the investigation for years to come. Clara, eager to find a more secluded campsite away from other hikers, encouraged Ethan to follow the narrower trail. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and despite the nagging voice in his head that whispered they should stick to the marked route, Ethan shouldered his pack and followed his wife into the gathering dusk. The path seemed well-maintained, worn smooth by years of foot traffic, though it led them steadily away from the main trail and deeper into the wilderness. They walked for another hour as the forest grew darker around them, their flashlights creating dancing circles of light on the path ahead. The sounds of the day began to fade, replaced by the nocturnal symphony of owls and rustling leaves. When they finally stopped to make camp, it was in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, a space that felt both intimate and isolated. Clara spread their tent while Ethan gathered firewood, both of them moving with the easy cooperation of newlyweds, still delighting in their shared domestic rhythm. That night, they sat beside their small campfire, Clara's head resting on Ethan's shoulder as they watched sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. The Polaroid camera sat beside them, loaded with fresh film and ready to capture their morning adventures. Clara spoke softly of their future plans, of the house they would buy, the children they hoped to have, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Ethan listened, his arm tightened around her, feeling a contentment so complete it seemed impossible that anything could disturb their perfect isolation. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line, patient and still as the ancient sequoias themselves. 3 days later, a park ranger conducting a routine patrol discovered their Honda Civic still parked at the Morro Rock trailhead. The car sat exactly where they had left it, keys locked inside, camping permits properly displayed on the dashboard. The vehicle showed no signs of tampering or forced entry, no broken windows or scratched paint that might indicate foul play. Inside, their spare clothing lay neatly folded in overnight bags. Clara's purse tucked beneath the passenger seat with her wallet, credit cards, and $63 in cash completely untouched. The initial search began immediately, with park rangers and volunteer search teams combing the official trails radiating out from Morro Rock. Search dogs picked up the couple's scent along the main trail, but lost it completely after 3 miles, as if Ethan and Clara had simply vanished into thin air. Helicopters circled overhead for days, their rotors echoing through the forest, as pilots scanned the canopy for any flash of color that might indicate camping gear or clothing. The thick forest canopy made aerial searches nearly impossible, and ground teams found themselves overwhelmed by the vastness of the wilderness. FBI Special Agent Thomas Harris arrived on the scene 5 days after the discovery of the abandoned car, his federal credentials opening doors that local law enforcement could not breach. Harris was 42 years old, a veteran agent with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases. But something about the Thompson disappearance felt different from the moment he stepped out of his government sedan. The forest seemed to swallow sound, creating an oppressive silence that made even seasoned searchers speak in whispers. Harris established his command post in the park's visitor center, covering the walls with topographic maps marked in different colors to indicate areas already searched. Red pins marked where search teams had found traces of human activity, but these discoveries proved frustratingly inconsequential. A candy wrapper that could have been dropped by any hiker, footprints on popular trails that belonged to dozens of different visitors. The forest had accepted thousands of hikers over the years, and separating the Thompsons' passage from the multitude of others proved nearly impossible. The breakthrough came on the 8th day of searching, when a volunteer found Clara's water bottle wedged between 2 rocks along a stream bed nearly 4 miles from the main trail. The bottle still contained water, its plastic surface scratched but intact, as if it had been dropped rather than lost during a fall. Harris examined the bottle personally, noting that it bore no signs of animal interference or weather damage that would suggest it had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. The discovery shifted the search to a new quadrant of the forest, but even this promising lead eventually yielded nothing more substantial. As days turned into weeks, the official search gradually wound down, hampered by budget constraints and the growing conviction among park officials that the couple had simply become lost and succumbed to the unforgiving wilderness. The Sequoia National Forest claimed lives regularly, they reminded Harris, usually hikers who overestimated their abilities or underestimated the dangers of the backcountry. Summer temperatures could reach dangerous levels during the day, while nights brought bone-chilling cold that could kill the unprepared. Wildlife, though generally avoiding humans, could turn aggressive when cornered or defending territory. But Harris could not shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the official explanation. In his experience, lost hikers left traces of their struggle, discarded gear as they lightened their loads, or evidence of attempts to signal for help. The Thompson case contained none of these elements. Their disappearance felt too clean, too complete, as if it had been orchestrated rather than accidental. The photograph haunted him most of all. Among the couple's possessions left in the car, Harris had discovered a single Polaroid picture tucked into Clara's purse, apparently taken during their first day in the forest. The image showed both Ethan and Clara smiling broadly, their arms around each other as they posed against a backdrop of massive sequoia trees. But as Harris studied the photograph under magnification, he noticed details in the background that troubled him deeply. The rock formation visible behind the couple did not match any landmark along the official trail system, and the angle of the shadow suggested the photograph had been taken much later in the day than their documented departure time would allow. Harris spent hours comparing the photograph to geological surveys and trail maps, trying to identify the location where it had been taken. The distinctive pattern of the rock formation, with its unusual striations and weathered surface, should have been easy to locate, but it appeared nowhere in the park's official documentation. It was as if the photograph had been taken in a part of the forest that did not officially exist, or in an area so remote and restricted that it never appeared on public maps. The case officially closed after 6 months of intermittent searching, classified as a presumed accidental death due to exposure and misadventure. The families held a memorial service in October, as the first snows began to fall across the high country of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Clara's mother wept as she accepted the folded flag from the Park Service, while Ethan's father stood stone-faced and silent, refusing to believe his son was truly gone. But Agent Harris kept the case file on his desk, the mysterious photograph paper-clipped to the inside cover, where he would see it every morning when he arrived at the office. In quiet moments between other cases, he would study the image through his magnifying glass, searching for clues that might have escaped his notice. The couple's smiles seemed to mock him, their happiness frozen in that instant before whatever had befallen them in the deep woods. Late at night, Harris would dream of walking through endless forests of giant trees, following voices that called to him from beyond the next bend in the trail, always just out of reach, always leading him deeper into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the basement archives of the FBI field office in Sacramento, casting their sterile glow over rows of metal filing cabinets that stretched into the shadows like mechanical sentinels guarding forgotten secrets. Agent Thomas Harris pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket, the prescription having grown stronger over the decade that had passed since the Thompson case first crossed his desk. His temples had gone silver at the edges, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from years of squinting at evidence photos and case files, but his obsession with unsolved mysteries burned as bright as ever. It was well past midnight on a Tuesday in March, when Harris found himself alone in the archives, surrounded by towers of case boxes that threatened to topple if disturbed. The building's heating system cycled on and off with mechanical regularity, filling the silence with the whisper of moving air through ancient ductwork. Harris had volunteered for the weekend overtime shift that had stretched into the following week, officially tasked with digitizing cold cases for the Bureau's new computer database system, but privately drawn back to the file that had haunted him for 10 years. The Thompson case folder sat open before him, its contents spread across the metal desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its solution. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, search team reports, and geological surveys covered every available surface, each document bearing the weight of his accumulated frustration. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and some of the photographs showed the telltale signs of chemical degradation that came with improper storage, but Harris had memorized every detail long ago. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he lifted the Polaroid photograph that had become the focal point of his obsession. The image measured exactly 3 1/8 inches square, its white border now slightly curved from years of handling. Ethan and Clara Thompson smiled back at him from across a decade, their faces frozen in that moment of perfect happiness before whatever darkness had claimed them in the forest. Clara's auburn hair caught the sunlight just as it had in life, while Ethan's protective arm around her shoulders spoke of a love that had been cut short before it could fully bloom. But it was the background of the photograph that held Harris's attention now, just as it had every time he examined the image over the past 10 years. Behind the couple, massive sequoia trees rose like ancient columns supporting the sky, their barks scarred by centuries of forest fires and healing. A distinctive rock formation jutted from the forest floor, its surface marked by unusual striations that created a pattern resembling a massive fingerprint pressed into stone. The formation stood approximately 12 feet high, with a distinctive overhang that created deep shadows even in daylight. Harris had spent countless hours over the years attempting to identify this location, comparing the photograph to every geological survey and topographic map of Sequoia National Park. He had hiked miles of trails, photographed hundreds of rock formations, and consulted with park geologists. But the distinctive formation in the Thompson photograph remained as elusive as the couple themselves. It was as if the rocks existed in some parallel version of the forest, visible only through the lens of Clara's camera. Tonight, however, Harris had access to technology that had been unimaginable 10 years earlier. The Bureau's new digital enhancement software could analyze photographs with microscopic precision, isolating individual pixels and enhancing details that were invisible to the naked eye. Harris carefully placed the Polaroid on the scanner bed, adjusting its position to ensure perfect alignment with the glass surface. The machine hummed to life, its bright light passing beneath the photograph like a digital archaeologist excavating layers of hidden information. The scanned image appeared on his computer monitor in startling clarity, every grain of the original photograph now visible as a distinct element. Harris leaned forward in his chair, his pulse quickening as the enhancement software began its analysis. Shadows that had appeared uniformly dark in the original photograph revealed subtle variations in tone and texture. The rock formation's surface showed details that had been lost in the Polaroid's limited resolution, including what appeared to be carved markings or natural erosion patterns that formed almost geometric shapes. But it was the forest floor behind the rocks that yielded the most significant discovery. Partially obscured by shadows and vegetation, Harris could now make out what appeared to be the corner of a man-made structure. The enhancement software highlighted the straight lines and right angles that nature rarely produced, revealing the edge of what might have been a wooden building or shelter hidden among the trees. The structure appeared weathered and old, its surface darkened by years of exposure to the elements. Harris felt his heart rate accelerate as he zoomed in on this new detail, his breathing shallow with excitement. A building in this remote location would explain why the rock formation had never appeared on official park maps. If the structure was old enough, it might predate the establishment of the national park system. Or, it could be located in an area that had been deemed too dangerous or environmentally sensitive for public access. The agent reached for his phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a geological consultant who had assisted the Bureau on several cases involving remote locations. Despite the late hour, Harris felt compelled to reach out immediately, his instincts telling him that this breakthrough could not wait for normal business hours. Dr. Hoffman answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep, but alert enough to recognize the urgency in Harris's tone. She had worked with the agent on 3 previous cases, and knew him to be methodical and careful, not given to flights of fancy or false alarms. When Harris described the enhanced image and its revelations, she agreed to meet him at the field office within the hour, her scientific curiosity overcoming her need for sleep. Harris spent the intervening time printing multiple copies of the enhanced photograph and gathering every piece of documentation related to the Thompson case. He arranged the materials on the conference room table like a shrine to his obsession, each document positioned with the precision of a man who had spent years searching for patterns in chaos. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, filling the air with the bitter aroma that had become his constant companion during long nights of investigation. Dr. Hoffman arrived as promised, her gray hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail and her field jacket smelling of pine needles from her weekend camping trip. She approached Harris's display with the methodical precision of a scientist, examining each photograph and document before moving to the next. Her silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes as she absorbed the details of the case, occasionally making soft sounds of interest or concern. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of professional certainty that Harris had been desperate to hear. The rock formation in the photograph was indeed distinctive and unusual, formed by a specific type of geological activity that occurred in only a few locations throughout the Sierra Nevada range. More importantly, Dr. Hoffman recognized the formation from her graduate research conducted 15 years earlier, when she had been part of a team studying ancient mining activity in remote areas of the national forest. The formation appeared in her research notes as part of a site located in what was now a restricted area of the forest, closed to public access due to unstable terrain and the presence of abandoned mining equipment. The area had been sealed off in the early 1990s after several accidents involving hikers who had wandered into dangerous mine shafts and collapsed tunnels. Access roads had been blocked, and the area had been allowed to return to its natural state, effectively erasing it from public consciousness. Harris felt a surge of vindication mixed with growing dread as Dr. Hoffman explained the location's history. If the Thompson couple had somehow found their way into this restricted area, they would have been far from any established search patterns. The original investigation had focused on official trails and camping areas, never considering that the couple might have ventured into forbidden territory. But the presence of the structure visible in the enhanced photograph suggested something more troubling than simple trespassing. Mining operations in the area had ceased decades before the Thompson disappearance, and any buildings associated with the mining activity should have been demolished or left to decay naturally. A maintained structure in such a remote location implied ongoing human activity, possibly illegal and almost certainly dangerous. Harris spent the remainder of the night creating a detailed report of his findings, documenting every step of the enhancement process and Dr. Hoffman's identification of the geological formation. The report grew to 37 pages as he meticulously recorded his reasoning and conclusions, knowing that any future investigation would require bulletproof documentation to justify the enormous expense and logistical challenges of searching the restricted area. As dawn broke over Sacramento, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Harris painfully of Clara Thompson's hair, he made the decision that would ultimately unravel a web of horror that had been growing in the forest for decades. The Thompson case was too complex and too geographically challenging for his field office to handle alone, but he knew exactly who to contact for assistance. Detective Isabella Cruz of the Tulare County Sheriff's Department had earned a reputation throughout California law enforcement for her uncanny ability to breathe life into cold cases that others had abandoned as hopeless. Harris had never worked with her directly, but her name appeared regularly in law enforcement bulletins detailing successful resolutions of cases that had baffled investigators for years. More importantly, her jurisdiction included the remote areas of the Sierra Nevada, where the restricted zone was located. Harris sealed his report in an overnight envelope, including copies of all relevant photographs and documentation. The package felt heavier than its actual weight as he carried it to the mailroom, burdened with 10 years of accumulated hope and frustration. He addressed the envelope in his careful handwriting, knowing that Detective Cruz would receive it within 24 hours, and hoping that she would see the same potential for resolution that now burned so brightly in his chest. The return trip to his office felt like a pilgrimage completed, each step carrying him further from the despair that had shadowed him for a decade and closer to something resembling hope. Harris sat at his desk as the building came alive around him with the sounds of the morning shift arriving for work. He opened the Thompson case file one final time, studying Clara's smiling face in the photograph that had launched his breakthrough. For the first time in 10 years, Thomas Harris allowed himself to believe that Ethan and Clara Thompson might finally receive the justice they deserved, and that the secrets buried in the restricted wilderness were about to be exhumed by someone with the skills and determination to see them through to their conclusion. The case that had defined his career was about to enter a new phase, guided by technology that had finally caught up to his intuition and driven by a new investigator who specialized in resurrection of the long dead. Harris closed the file folder with the reverence of a man sealing a coffin, knowing that when it opened again, it would be in hands better equipped to handle the darkness that lay within its pages. Detective Isabella Cruz pressed her hiking boots against the forest floor with deliberate care, each step calculated to avoid the loose rocks and rotting branches that could announce her presence to anyone watching from the shadows. The morning fog clung to the ancient sequoias like ghostly fingers, muffling sound and reducing visibility to mere yards in any direction. She had been hiking for 2 hours through increasingly treacherous terrain, following GPS coordinates that Agent Harris had provided based on Dr. Hoffman's geological analysis of the enhanced photograph. The weight of her tactical vest pressed against her shoulders as she navigated around a massive fallen tree, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter and covered in a thick carpet of moss that spoke of decades of decay. Cruz paused to check her compass again, her breath visible in the cool mountain air as she confirmed her bearing. The silence of the forest felt oppressive, broken only by the distant call of a woodpecker and the soft whisper of wind through the canopy high above. Cruz had spent 15 years working cold cases, breathing life back into investigations that others had abandoned as hopeless. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos, to follow threads of evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed by previous investigators. But something about the Thompson case felt different from the moment she opened Agent Harris's meticulously prepared package. The photograph that had haunted Harris for a decade now occupied her thoughts with equal intensity, its implications growing more disturbing with each hour of analysis. The restricted area of the forest stretched before her like a forgotten world, untouched by the steady stream of tourists who visited the more accessible regions of the park. No maintained trails existed here, only game paths worn by deer and the occasional bear, winding between trees that had been growing since before European settlers first set foot in California. The air tasted different in this place, heavy with the scent of decomposing leaves and the mineral tang of underground springs. Cruz spotted the distinctive rock formation first, its familiar striations matching the enhanced photograph with uncanny precision. The massive stone structure rose from the forest floor like a prehistoric monument, its surface scarred by centuries of weather and marked with patterns that seemed almost deliberately carved. She approached slowly, her hand resting on the grip of her service weapon as her eyes swept the surrounding area for any sign of human presence. Behind the rock formation, exactly as the enhanced photograph had suggested, stood the remnants of what had once been a substantial wooden structure. The building had been constructed with the solid craftsmanship of an earlier era, its foundation made from mortared stones that had withstood decades of neglect. The walls showed signs of recent maintenance despite their weathered appearance, with newer boards replacing sections that had succumbed to rot and exposure. The front door stood slightly ajar, hanging on hinges that had been recently oiled to prevent the telltale squeak that might alert approaching visitors. Cruz drew her weapon and approached the entrance with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous investigations. The interior of the building was darker than the forest outside, lit only by thin shafts of sunlight that penetrated gaps in the weathered walls. What she found inside defied her expectations and filled her with a growing sense of dread that settled in her stomach like cold lead. The space had been converted into a workshop of sorts, with workbenches lining the walls and tools hanging from hooks, with the organized precision of someone who spent considerable time in this place. Handsaws, chisels, planes, and other woodworking implements showed signs of regular use and careful maintenance. The air inside smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, with an underlying odor that Cruz could not immediately identify, but which made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Scattered across the workbenches were dozens of wooden boxes in various stages of completion, each approximately the size of a large jewelry box, but constructed with joints so precise they seemed to flow together like a single piece of wood. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the work of someone who possessed both skill and obsessive attention to detail. Cruz opened one of the completed boxes with the tip of her pen, revealing an interior lined with black velvet that had been fitted with precise compartments sized to hold specific objects. It was while examining the third box that Cruz made her first significant discovery. Wedged between two boards near the back corner of the workshop, partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp, she found a familiar rectangular object that made her heart rate spike with recognition. The Polaroid camera bore the same model number as the one mentioned in the Thompson case file, its silver and black plastic housing showing signs of use but no obvious damage. Cruz photographed the camera's position before carefully extracting it from its hiding place, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The camera's film counter showed that most of a roll had been exposed, with only 3 shots remaining. She secured the device in an evidence bag, already planning the careful process that would be required to develop the film without destroying whatever images it might contain. The workshop held other secrets that spoke to the obsessive nature of its occupant. A metal filing cabinet in one corner contained dozens of folders organized with military precision, each labeled with dates spanning the previous 2 decades. Cruz opened the first folder with growing unease, revealing photographs of couples hiking in the forest, apparently taken from concealment over long periods of observation. The images showed an intimate familiarity with the subject's routines and habits, documenting their movements with the methodical attention of a predator studying prey. Among these surveillance photographs, Cruz found images of Ethan and Clara Thompson that predated their disappearance by several months. The pictures showed them camping in other locations, hiking different trails, completely unaware that they were being watched and documented. The photographer had captured intimate moments between the couple, invasion of privacy that spoke to hours of patient stalking and observation. The most disturbing discovery awaited her in the workshop's back room, accessible through a heavy wooden door that had been reinforced with steel plates and secured with multiple locks. The room beyond was smaller than the main workshop, but contained equipment that made Cruz's blood run cold with recognition. Developing trays, chemical baths, and photographic equipment filled the space, along with dozens of photographs hanging from lines like macabre decorations. The photographs depicted scenes that would haunt Cruz for the remainder of her career. Images of frightened faces in what appeared to be underground chambers, people in various states of distress and captivity, and scenes of violence that spoke to systematic torture and murder. Among these horrific images, she found photographs of Ethan and Clara Thompson that had clearly been taken after their disappearance, showing them in what appeared to be a stone-walled chamber lit by harsh artificial lighting. Clara's face in the photographs showed the terror and desperation that came with the realization that help was not coming, while Ethan's expression had evolved from fear to something approaching resignation over what appeared to be multiple sessions. The photographs were dated with precise handwriting that documented a timeline of captivity extending far beyond the initial search period, suggesting that the couple had been held alive for weeks or possibly months after their supposed disappearance. Cruz forced herself to examine each photograph with professional detachment, documenting their contents and searching for any clues that might indicate the location where they had been taken. The stone walls visible in the background appeared to be natural rock formations, rather than constructed surfaces, suggesting that the chamber was underground or built into a hillside. Primitive wooden furniture and what appeared to be camping equipment indicated that the space had been prepared specifically for long-term captivity. A leather-bound journal hidden beneath the developing equipment provided the final piece of the puzzle that Cruz had been unconsciously assembling. The journal belonged to Samuel Keller, according to the name inscribed on the cover in the same precise handwriting that dated the photographs. The entries detailed an obsessive fascination with couples who visited the forest, documenting their activities and developing elaborate plans for their capture and confinement. Keller's writing revealed a mind that had descended gradually into madness over the course of several years, beginning with voyeuristic observation and escalating to increasingly violent fantasies. The journal entries showed a methodical progression from passive watching to active stalking, and finally to the construction of what he referred to as his collection chambers, underground spaces designed to hold his victims for extended periods. The entries describing the Thompson abduction were written with the clinical detachment of someone documenting a scientific experiment. Keller had spent months planning their capture, studying their routines and preferences, and preparing the chamber that would become their prison. He had constructed false trail markers to lead them away from the main hiking routes, and had prepared contingencies for various scenarios that might arise during the abduction process. Most chilling were the entries that followed, documenting Keller's interactions with his captives over the weeks that followed their disappearance. The journal revealed that Clara had died first, succumbing to a combination of injury and despair after 3 weeks of captivity. Ethan had survived much longer, his carpenter's skills apparently making him useful to Keller in the construction and maintenance of the underground complex. The journal entries revealed that Keller had not acted alone in the later phases of his criminal activity. References to someone called Dave suggested that he had recruited an assistant, possibly someone who shared his obsessions or who could be manipulated into compliance through fear or financial incentive. The entries indicated that this accomplice had been involved in the construction of additional chambers and the disposal of evidence from Keller's crimes. Cruz photographed every page of the journal using her digital camera, her hands trembling slightly as she documented evidence of crimes that stretched back nearly 2 decades. The scope of Keller's activities suggested that the Thompson couple had been only 2 victims among many, and that somewhere in the forest around her lay a complex of underground chambers that represented one of the most horrific crime scenes she had ever encountered. The workshop also contained detailed architectural drawings that showed the layout of an extensive underground tunnel system. The drawings were executed with professional precision, indicating that Keller possessed significant construction skills beyond his apparent woodworking abilities. The tunnels connected multiple chambers of varying sizes, with some designated for storage and others clearly intended for human occupancy. Ventilation systems, drainage, and even primitive electrical work were indicated in the plans, suggesting that the complex had been designed for long-term use. As Cruz prepared to leave the workshop with her evidence, she noticed fresh wood shavings near one of the workbenches, indicating that someone had used the space recently. The discovery sent ice through her veins as she realized that Keller might still be active, or that someone else had taken over his operations. The implication suggested that the Thompson case was not a historical investigation, but an ongoing threat that required immediate law enforcement response. The hike back to her vehicle felt like a journey through a nightmare landscape, with every shadow potentially concealing a threat, and every sound suggesting pursuit. Cruz clutched the evidence bags containing the camera and journal, knowing that she carried proof of crimes that would shock even veteran investigators. The forest around her had been transformed from a place of natural beauty into something sinister and threatening, a hunting ground where predators had operated undetected for decades. By the time Cruz reached her car, her mind was already working through the logistics of what would need to be a massive investigation. The underground complex would require specialized equipment and personnel to explore safely, and the scope of Keller's crimes suggested that multiple jurisdictions and federal agencies would need to be involved. But first, she needed to develop the film from the Thompsons' camera and confirm her worst fears about what had really happened to them in the depths of the forest. The trailer park on the outskirts of Visalia looked like civilization's last stand against the encroaching desert, its collection of weathered mobile homes arranged in crooked rows that followed no discernible pattern. Detective Cruz pulled her unmarked sedan between a rusted pickup truck and a motorcycle missing both wheels, the gravel beneath her tires crunching with the sound of broken glass and discarded dreams. The address she had extracted from Keller's journal led her here, to Lot 17, where David Collins had been living in the shadows of his complicity for over a decade. Collins emerged from his trailer before Cruz could knock, as if he had been watching her approach from behind the torn curtains that hung in his front window. The man who stood before her bore little resemblance to the robust construction worker described in the police reports from 10 years earlier. His frame had withered to scarecrow proportions, his clothes hanging loose on a body that seemed to have folded in on itself with the weight of whatever secrets he carried. His eyes darted constantly between Cruz's face and the ground, never holding contact for more than a few seconds before skittering away like frightened animals. The interior of the trailer reeked of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey, with newspapers covering the windows to block out the harsh California sun. Collins gestured toward a sagging couch covered in cat hair, despite the absence of any visible pets, his movements jerky and nervous, as if controlled by invisible strings. Cruz chose to remain standing, her instincts warning her that sitting would put her at a tactical disadvantage in the cramped space. Collins lit his fourth cigarette since her arrival, with hands that shook so badly the flame wavered like a candle in wind. The nicotine seemed to steady him slightly, though his leg continued to bounce with manic energy that spoke of deeper psychological disturbance. When he finally began to speak, his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, forcing Cruz to lean closer despite her revulsion at his unwashed odor and the sour smell of his fear. The story that tumbled from Collins' lips painted a picture of horror that exceeded even Cruz's darkest expectations. Samuel Keller had recruited him 8 years earlier, when Collins was struggling with gambling debts and facing eviction from a previous apartment. What had begun as simple manual labor, helping Keller with construction projects in remote areas of the forest, had gradually evolved into something far more sinister as Collins found himself drawn deeper into his employer's twisted world. Collins described the isolation chambers in excruciating detail, his words painting images that would haunt Cruz for years to come. The underground complex consisted of 7 separate rooms carved directly into the bedrock, each designed for a specific purpose in Keller's systematic destruction of human dignity. The largest chamber served as Keller's workshop and command center, equipped with surveillance equipment that allowed him to monitor his captives at all times. Smaller chambers functioned as individual cells, their stone walls weeping with condensation that created a perpetual dampness that seeped into prisoners' bones. The most disturbing revelation concerned what Keller had euphemistically called the transformation chamber, a specially designed space where he conducted psychological experiments on his captives. Collins described walls covered with photographs of previous victims, arranged in chronological order to document their psychological deterioration over weeks or months of captivity. The chamber contained recording equipment that captured every sound made by prisoners, creating audio archives that Keller studied obsessively to perfect his techniques of mental destruction. Collins's voice cracked as he described his first encounter with Ethan Thompson, 3 months after the couple's disappearance. Clara had died weeks earlier from complications related to injuries sustained during their capture. But Ethan had survived, though barely recognizable as the happy newlywed from the photographs Cruz had seen. Keller had begun what he called the rebuilding process, systematically stripping away Ethan's sense of identity and replacing it with something more compliant to his will. The process involved constant psychological manipulation, combined with periods of isolation so complete that Ethan began to lose track of time and reality. Keller would alternate between periods of brutal treatment and unexpected kindness, creating a trauma bond that left his victim desperate for any human contact, even from his captor. Food became a reward for compliance, while resistance brought not just physical punishment but complete sensory deprivation that could last for days. Collins described watching Ethan's transformation with a mixture of fascination and horror that clearly disturbed him even years later. The carpenter's skills that had defined his identity were perverted by Keller into tools of imprisonment, as Ethan was forced to help construct new chambers and improve the existing ones. Each improvement he made to his own prison seemed to strip away another piece of his former self, until the man who emerged bore little resemblance to the loving husband who had entered the forest. The psychological transformation accelerated after Keller began forcing Ethan to participate in the capture of new victims. Collins described the elaborate preparations that preceded each abduction, with Ethan required to help construct the false trail markers and prepare the chambers that would hold the next victims. The gradual escalation of involvement was carefully orchestrated to ensure that Ethan became complicit before he fully understood what he was doing. Collins revealed that the meeting point Keller had established was a seemingly innocent maintenance shed located near one of the forest's legitimate service roads. The shed served as a staging area where victims were processed before being transported to the underground complex, and where Keller stored equipment too sensitive to keep in his workshop. The location allowed him to operate with a veneer of legitimacy, appearing to be a Forest Service employee to anyone who might observe his activities. The transformation of Ethan from victim to accomplice had been completed gradually over nearly 2 years of captivity. Collins described a breaking point that occurred when Keller forced Ethan to choose between his own survival and the life of another captive, a choice that shattered whatever remained of his moral framework. From that moment forward, Ethan became an active participant in the cycle of abduction and murder, his knowledge of human psychology making him even more effective than Keller at breaking new victims. Collins produced a small digital camera from beneath his couch cushions, his hands shaking violently as he offered it to Cruz. The device contained photographs that documented the final stages of Ethan's transformation, showing him working alongside Keller with an efficiency that spoke of complete psychological submission. In the final images, Ethan appeared calm and focused as he performed tasks that would have horrified his former self, his expression showing no trace of the trauma that had shaped his new identity. The most chilling revelation came when Collins described Ethan's reaction to Keller's death 2 years earlier. Rather than celebrating his freedom or attempting to escape, Ethan had simply assumed control of the operation, continuing the cycle of abduction and murder with methodical precision. Collins had been too terrified to leave or report the crimes, trapped by his own complicity and Ethan's threat to reveal his involvement to authorities. Cruz felt bile rise in her throat as Collins described the current state of the underground complex, still operational under Ethan's management, but evolved beyond Keller's original vision. The psychological techniques had been refined through years of experimentation, with Ethan proving even more adept at breaking victims than his former captor. The transformation chambers had been expanded and improved, incorporating lessons learned from each successive victim. Collins produced a hand-drawn map of the tunnel system, his artistic skills surprisingly precise despite his obvious mental deterioration. The map revealed the true scope of the underground complex, with dozens of chambers connected by a network of tunnels that stretched for nearly a mile beneath the forest floor. New construction had continued after Keller's death, with Ethan expanding the facility to accommodate larger numbers of simultaneous captives. The meeting point had also evolved, with Ethan establishing multiple staging areas throughout the forest to reduce the risk of detection. Collins described a sophisticated system of false identities and forged permits that allowed Ethan to operate with official sanction, appearing to be a legitimate forestry contractor to anyone who might question his presence in restricted areas. Cruz documented every detail of Collins's confession with her digital recorder, knowing that his testimony would be crucial to building a case against Ethan and locating the underground complex. The scope of the crime suggested that dozens of people had disappeared over the years, their families never knowing the true fate of their loved ones. The investigation would require massive resources and coordination between multiple agencies to address the full extent of the criminal enterprise. Collins broke down completely as he described his most recent involvement in the operation, sobbing uncontrollably as he confessed to helping Ethan capture a young couple just 3 months earlier. The guilt had been eating away at him for weeks, driving him deeper into alcoholism and paranoia, as he struggled with the knowledge that his cowardice had condemned innocent people to unimaginable suffering. As Cruz prepared to arrest Collins and secure him as a witness, he provided one final piece of information that sent ice through her veins. Ethan had been asking questions about the reopened Thompson investigation, somehow learning of her involvement despite the confidential nature of the case. Collins believed that Ethan might be planning to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his continued operation, including law enforcement officers who got too close to the truth. The drive back to headquarters felt like a journey through a nightmare landscape, with Cruz's mind reeling from the scope and horror of what she had uncovered. The Thompson case had evolved far beyond a simple missing persons investigation into something that challenged her understanding of human capacity for evil. The forest that she had always viewed as a place of natural beauty had been revealed as hunting grounds for predators who operated with impunity in the shadows between civilization and wilderness. Collins's confession provided the roadmap she needed to locate the underground complex and potentially rescue any current victims. But it also revealed that she was now hunting a predator who possessed intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedures and the psychological tools necessary to transform his victims into willing accomplices. The investigation had entered a new phase that would test every skill she had developed during her career, while facing an adversary whose understanding of human psychology had been honed through years of systematic torture and murder. Cruz realized with growing dread that she might already be too late to save Ethan Thompson, who had been so thoroughly transformed that he now represented a threat equal to or greater than his original captor. The case would require her to confront not just the perpetrators of horrific crimes, but the disturbing reality that victims could become monsters through systematic psychological destruction, creating a cycle of violence that transcended individual guilt or innocence. The FBI forensics team descended into the underground complex like modern archaeologists excavating a tomb of horrors, their portable lights casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed 18 years of systematic human destruction. Detective Cruz stood at the entrance to the tunnel system, watching technicians in white hazmat suits disappear into the darkness with equipment that would help quantify the scope of crimes that defied human comprehension. The morning air above ground carried the scent of pine needles and fresh earth, a cruel contrast to the stench of decay and human suffering that rose from the depths below. The main chamber exceeded even Collins's detailed description in its elaborate construction and horrifying purpose. The stone walls had been carved with precision that spoke of years of patient labor, creating a space that was both dungeon and workshop, torture chamber and living quarters. Fluorescent lights jury-rigged to a generator provided harsh illumination that revealed every detail of Keller's legacy and Ethan's continued improvements. The walls were covered with photographs arranged in chronological order, creating a timeline of suffering that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Cruz forced herself to examine each photograph despite the nausea that rose in her throat with each image. The earliest pictures dated from 1990, showing young couples who had clearly been captured during romantic getaways in the forest. Their faces progressed from initial terror through desperate hope to final resignation, documenting the psychological journey that Keller had perfected through years of experimentation. The photographs were arranged in groups, with each victim cluster telling a complete story of capture, transformation, and ultimate disposal. The forensics team worked with methodical precision, collecting DNA samples from surfaces throughout the complex that would later reveal the true scope of the crimes. Blood residue invisible to the naked eye told stories written in genetic code, each sample representing a human life that had ended in this underground hell. The team's portable spectrometer detected traces of at least 43 different individuals throughout the chamber system, a number that made Cruz's knees weak with the implications. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the FBI's lead forensic anthropologist, emerged from one of the smaller chambers carrying evidence bags that contained fragments of human remains. Her usual professional composure had cracked slightly, revealing the emotional toll of cataloging evidence from what appeared to be one of the most extensive serial killer operations in American history. The bone fragments showed tool marks consistent with deliberate dismemberment, suggesting that disposal of victims had been as systematically planned as their capture and confinement. The transformation chamber that Collins had described proved to be even more disturbing in reality than his whispered confessions had suggested. The walls were covered with audio equipment and recording devices that had captured years of psychological torture sessions. Speakers mounted throughout the chamber could blast sounds at volumes designed to disorient and break down mental resistance, while cameras positioned at every angle ensured that no moment of suffering went unrecorded. Crews discovered journals hidden throughout the complex, written in two distinct handwriting styles, that documented the evolution of the operation, from Keller's original vision to Ethan's refined improvements. Keller's entries read like scientific observations, clinical descriptions of psychological experiments conducted on unwilling human subjects. His handwriting was neat and controlled, reflecting a mind that maintained the illusion of rationality even while committing acts of unspeakable cruelty. Ethan's journals, written after he assumed control of the operation, revealed a different but equally disturbing perspective. His entries showed sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques, combined with innovations that made the transformation process more efficient and reliable. Where Keller had been driven by sadistic curiosity, Ethan appeared motivated by a desire to perfect the system that had destroyed and recreated him. The most chilling discovery awaited crews in what appeared to be Ethan's private office, a chamber that had been constructed entirely during his tenure as the operations leader. The space contained detailed files on dozens of potential victims, complete with surveillance photographs, personal information, and psychological profiles that demonstrated months or years of patient stalking. The files were organized with the precision of a legitimate business operation, suggesting that victim selection had become a sophisticated process. Among these files, crews found documentation of captures that had occurred as recently as 6 weeks earlier, proving that the operation remained active under Ethan's leadership. The most recent victims appeared to be a young couple from Oregon, who had been reported missing during a camping trip in the Cascade Mountains, hundreds of miles from the underground complex. The scope of Ethan's hunting grounds had expanded far beyond Keller's original territory, suggesting a level of mobility and resources that made the threat exponentially more dangerous. Computer equipment discovered in Ethan's office revealed the technological sophistication that had evolved since Keller's death. Multiple laptops contained encrypted files detailing victim acquisition strategies, psychological manipulation techniques, and disposal methods that had been refined through years of practical application. The computers were connected to surveillance systems that monitored hiking trails throughout multiple national forests, creating a network that allowed Ethan to identify and track potential victims across vast geographic areas. The DNA analysis results that arrived 3 days later confirmed Cruz's worst fears, while revealing the true scope of the horror that had been perpetrated beneath the forest floor. Genetic material from 67 different individuals had been identified throughout the complex, representing nearly 2 decades of systematic murder. The earliest samples dated from 1990, 2 years before Keller's first documented construction activity, suggesting that the operation had prehistoric elements that predated even the comprehensive journal records. Dr. Martinez's preliminary forensic analysis revealed evidence of at least 12 different murder methods employed over the years, with techniques evolving from crude strangulation and blunt force trauma to more sophisticated approaches that minimized physical evidence. The progression suggested learning and adaptation, with each successive murder teaching lessons that improved future operations. The most recent evidence showed techniques so refined that victims appeared to have died from natural causes, making discovery and prosecution exponentially more difficult. The tunnel system itself told a story of continuous expansion and improvement that had accelerated dramatically after Ethan assumed control. Ground-penetrating radar revealed chambers and passages that extended far beyond the areas documented in Keller's original plans, suggesting ongoing construction activity that had continued right up to the time of discovery. The newest construction showed innovations in ventilation, drainage, and soundproofing that made the facility capable of holding larger numbers of simultaneous victims while remaining completely undetectable from the surface. Crews spent hours studying architectural drawings found in Ethan's files, trying to understand the scope of the underground complex that had grown like a cancer beneath the forest floor. The drawings revealed a facility that resembled a small underground city, with specialized chambers for different aspects of the operation. Storage rooms contained supplies sufficient to maintain the complex for months without resupply, while workshop areas held equipment for everything from victim restraint to body disposal. The psychological profiles that Ethan had compiled on potential victims revealed a level of sophistication that horrified experienced FBI behavioral analysts. Each file contained detailed assessments of personality types, relationship dynamics, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the capture and transformation process. The profiles were cross-referenced with success rates from previous operations, creating a database that made victim selection into a precise science. Evidence of Ethan's continued activity extended beyond the underground complex itself. Financial records recovered from his office revealed a network of legitimate businesses that provided cover for his criminal operations, including a forestry consulting firm that gave him official access to restricted areas throughout the western United States. Bank accounts showed regular income from government contracts, creating a facade of respectability that allowed him to operate without suspicion. The most disturbing discovery came when crews realized that Ethan had been monitoring the reopened Thompson investigation from its earliest stages. Files in his office contained detailed information about Agent Harris's activities, including copies of his correspondence with Dr. Hoffman and transcripts of phone conversations that should have been confidential. The surveillance suggested access to law enforcement communications that implied either sophisticated technical capabilities or potential corruption within the investigative agencies. Vehicle registration records linked to Ethan's various identities revealed a fleet of trucks and vans equipped for extended wilderness operations, including mobile workshops that could support construction and disposal activities in remote locations. GPS tracking data recovered from these vehicles showed movement patterns that correlated with missing person reports from multiple states, suggesting that the operation had expanded far beyond its original California base. The forensic team's analysis of the complex's electrical and communication systems revealed capabilities that exceeded those of many legitimate research facilities. High-capacity generators provided reliable power for extended operations, while satellite communication equipment allowed Ethan to maintain contact with the outside world, even from deep underground. The sophistication suggested resources and technical knowledge that had been accumulated over years of successful criminal operations. Crews discovered evidence that Ethan had begun recruiting additional accomplices to support the expanded operation, following the same gradual corruption process that Keller had used to transform him from victim to perpetrator. Psychological profiles of potential recruits showed the same methodical approach to victim selection, but focused on individuals with specific skills that could benefit the operation. The recruitment files suggested that the cycle of corruption had begun to replicate itself, threatening to create multiple centers of criminal activity. The investigation revealed that Ethan had established safe houses and staging areas throughout the western United States, creating a network that supported operations across multiple states and jurisdictions. Each facility was registered under different identities and maintained with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized the main complex. The network made him nearly impossible to track using conventional investigative methods, while providing backup locations that could continue operations even if the primary facility was discovered. As crews compiled her final report on the underground complex, she realized that the Thompson case had exposed something far more threatening than a single serial killer or even a localized criminal operation. Ethan Thompson had evolved from victim to perpetrator to organizational leader, creating a self-sustaining system of horror that could continue indefinitely regardless of individual participants. The discovery suggested that similar operations might exist in other locations, hidden beneath the wilderness areas where people disappeared without explanation. The psychological transformation that had converted Ethan from loving husband to systematic killer represented a form of human destruction that challenged fundamental assumptions about morality and rehabilitation. His case demonstrated that under sufficient psychological pressure, any human being could be transformed into something unrecognizable, creating new predators who were potentially more dangerous than their original captors. The investigation had revealed not just a crime, but a process of evil that could reproduce itself indefinitely, spreading like a virus through the vulnerable population of wilderness visitors who trusted in the safety of nature's solitude. Detective Isabella Cruz felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones as she reviewed the case files spread across her kitchen table at 2 a.m. The fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows across crime scene photographs and forensic reports that documented the scope of horrors she had uncovered in the underground complex. Her coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she continued to sip the bitter liquid while her mind raced through the connections and patterns that might lead her to Ethan Thompson's current location. The anonymous phone call had come at 11:37, according to the timestamp on her department-issued cell phone. The voice on the other end spoke in careful, measured tones that conveyed information without revealing emotion or identity. The caller claimed to have seen suspicious activity near the old Mineral King staging area, describing a man matching Ethan's description loading supplies from a van into backpacks suitable for extended wilderness travel. The tip included specific details about the vehicle's license plate and the unusual timing of the activity during late evening hours. Crews had received dozens of similar calls since news of the underground complex had leaked to local media. But something about this particular tip felt different. The caller possessed knowledge of law enforcement terminology and investigative procedures that suggested familiarity with police work, while the specificity of the details provided indicated first-hand observation rather than speculation or attention-seeking behavior. Most significantly, the caller had mentioned seeing photographic equipment among the supplies being loaded, a detail that sent ice through Cruz's veins as she considered its implications. The drive to Mineral King required nearly 2 hours through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily into terrain that became increasingly remote with each mile. Cruz had notified dispatch of her destination and expected return time, following protocols that had been drilled into her during 15 years of police work. Her service weapon sat secure in its shoulder holster, while additional ammunition and emergency supplies filled the tactical vest that she wore beneath her civilian jacket. The staging area appeared deserted when Cruz arrived, with only her vehicle visible in the gravel parking lot that served hikers accessing the high country trails. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape that transformed familiar features into something alien and threatening. She sat in her car for several minutes, studying the surrounding terrain through binoculars and listening for any sounds that might indicate human presence in the area. The white van described by the anonymous caller sat parked at the far edge of the lot, its license plate matching the number provided in the tip. Cruz approached the vehicle with her weapon drawn, using techniques learned during countless high-risk encounters throughout her career. The van's windows were tinted too darkly to reveal the interior, but she could detect no movement or signs of recent activity. The hood felt warm to her touch, indicating that the engine had been running within the past few hours. Examining the ground around the van revealed boot prints in the soft earth, leading away from the vehicle toward a trail that disappeared into dense forest. The prints were fresh, with sharp edges that indicated they had been made within the last few hours. Cruz photographed the tracks with her digital camera, documenting their size and tread pattern for future comparison, with evidence collected from crime scenes. The trail itself showed signs of recent passage, with broken twigs and disturbed vegetation marking a path that deviated from the established hiking route. Cruz followed the tracks using a small flashlight, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise that might alert anyone waiting ahead. The forest around her seemed unnaturally quiet, with none of the nocturnal sounds that typically filled wilderness areas during late evening hours. After hiking for nearly 30 minutes, Cruz discovered what appeared to be a hastily constructed campsite in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. A single tent sat in the center of the space, with camping equipment arranged around a cold fire pit that showed evidence of recent use. The setup looked legitimate to casual observation, but Cruz's experienced eye detected subtle details that suggested something more sinister than recreational camping. The tent's positioning allowed observation of the trail from multiple directions, while remaining concealed from casual hikers, suggesting tactical rather than recreational considerations. Expensive photographic equipment visible through the tent's mesh windows seemed inappropriate for a simple camping trip, while the absence of food preparation areas indicated that the site might not be intended for extended occupation. Cruz circled the campsite carefully, using her flashlight to document evidence while maintaining awareness of potential threats from the surrounding forest. She discovered additional boot prints leading away from the camp toward what appeared to be an animal trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. The prints suggested that someone had left the campsite recently, possibly after observing her arrival in the parking area. The sound of a breaking branch behind her caused Cruz to spin around with her weapon raised, her heart hammering against her ribs as adrenaline flooded her system. The forest remained still and silent, but she could feel the presence of another person watching from the shadows between the trees. Her tactical training kicked in automatically, positioning her body to minimize exposure while scanning for threats that might be concealed in the darkness. The attack came without warning, a figure emerging from behind a massive pine tree with inhuman silence and precision. Cruz caught a glimpse of a face she recognized from decade-old photographs before something struck the back of her head with devastating force, sending her consciousness spinning into darkness. Her service weapon fell from nerveless fingers as she collapsed to the forest floor, her last coherent thought focusing on the radio in her vest that might summon help if she could reach it. When awareness returned, Cruz found herself in a stone-walled chamber that she recognized from crime scene photographs as one of the isolation cells in the underground complex. The familiar fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows on walls that wept with condensation, while the smell of damp earth and human suffering filled her nostrils with nauseating intensity. Her head throbbed with pain that made thinking difficult, and her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive in ways that suggested chemical sedation. The restraints that held her to a metal chair were professionally applied, tight enough to prevent escape but positioned to avoid cutting off circulation. Her service weapon, radio, and cell phone had been removed, along with her tactical vest and any other equipment that might aid in escape or communication. The isolation was complete, with only the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond the cell's illuminated area. Ethan Thompson stood in the chamber's doorway, but the man before her bore little resemblance to the happy newlywed from the photographs in the case file. His face had been carved by years of psychological trauma into something harder and more predatory, while his eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a creature that had abandoned human empathy. He moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to operating in confined spaces, every gesture calculated for maximum efficiency. The camera in his hands was a professional model equipped with powerful flash units that could illuminate the chamber's darkest corners. Cruz recognized it as similar to equipment that had been used to document previous victims, understanding with growing horror that she was about to become another entry in the photographic record of suffering that lined the walls of the main chamber. The inevitability of her situation settled over her like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until breathing became labored. Ethan began taking photographs with the methodical precision of someone following a well-established routine, the camera's flash creating stark contrasts between light and shadow that emphasized every detail of the chamber and its occupant. Each image captured a different angle of Cruz's predicament, documenting her restraints, facial expression, and the fear that she struggled to suppress despite years of training in crisis management. The psychological impact of the photography session exceeded the physical discomfort of her restraints and injuries. Cruz understood that each flash represented another step in a ritual that had been perfected through years of practice on dozens of previous victims. The images would be added to the collection that covered the walls of the main chamber, becoming part of the permanent record of human suffering that fed Ethan's psychological needs. Between photographs, Ethan adjusted lighting equipment with the expertise of a professional photographer, fine-tuning the illumination to capture every nuance of expression and emotion. His movements were unhurried and confident, suggesting complete control over the situation and absolute certainty that no rescue would interrupt his work. The underground location provided perfect isolation from the outside world, with layers of stone and earth absorbing any sounds that might escape the chamber. Cruz attempted to maintain her psychological equilibrium by focusing on investigative details that might prove useful if she survived the encounter. She memorized the chamber's layout, noting ventilation systems, electrical connections, and structural features that might indicate weaknesses in the facility's design. The information felt pathetically inadequate against the overwhelming reality of her situation, but professional habits provided some comfort in the face of approaching horror. The camera's memory card filled gradually with images that documented Cruz's transition from defiant law enforcement officer to terrified victim, each photograph marking another step in the psychological destruction that had claimed so many previous captives. Ethan's expression remained impassive throughout the session, showing no emotion or human connection that might be exploited to gain advantage or mercy. When the photography session concluded, Ethan reviewed the digital images on the camera's display screen with the critical eye of an artist evaluating his work. Some images were deleted immediately, while others were flagged for inclusion in what Cruz assumed was the permanent collection that served as trophies from successful captures. The methodical review process suggested standards and criteria that had been refined through years of practice. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoing through the tunnels as he left the chamber marked the beginning of Cruz's true ordeal. The isolation that followed was complete and absolute, with only the dripping water and her own breathing to break the oppressive silence. The fluorescent lights remained on, creating a harsh illumination that prevented sleep while emphasizing the hopelessness of her situation. Hours passed without any sign of human presence, the silence stretching until Cruz began to question whether Ethan would return, or if she had been abandoned to die slowly from dehydration and starvation. The psychological impact of uncertainty proved as effective as direct torture, with her imagination creating scenarios that might be worse than whatever Ethan actually planned for her future. The chamber's temperature remained constant but uncomfortably cool, with the stone walls radiating cold that penetrated her clothing and settled into her bones. The dampness in the air made breathing difficult while creating conditions that would accelerate hypothermia if her situation continued for an extended period. Every aspect of the environment seemed designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing the possibility of escape or rescue. Cruz's police training included instruction in surviving captivity situations, but the reality of her predicament exceeded anything covered in classroom scenarios or field exercises. The isolation chamber represented the culmination of years of refinement and improvement, designed by someone with intimate understanding of human psychology and extensive experience in breaking down mental resistance. The facility's sophistication made escape seem impossible, while rescue appeared increasingly unlikely. The realization that she had become part of the cycle of violence that she had dedicated her career to breaking brought a despair that threatened to overwhelm her remaining psychological defenses. The photographs that Ethan had taken would join the collection that documented nearly 2 decades of suffering, while her disappearance would likely be attributed to the hazards of police work rather than recognition of the systematic predation that continued beneath the forest floor. As the hours stretched into what might have been days, Cruz began to understand the psychological mechanisms that had transformed previous victims into compliant accomplices. The combination of isolation, fear, and complete dependence on her captor for survival created conditions that could reshape human personality in ways that seemed impossible from the outside. The transformation process that had claimed Ethan Thompson was beginning to work its insidious influence on her own mind, threatening to complete the cycle of corruption that had started with Samuel Keller decades earlier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mineral King parking lot, where Detective Isabella Cruz's unmarked sedan sat abandoned, its driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Rodriguez approached the vehicle with the methodical caution of an officer who had seen too many crime scenes end badly, his boots crunching on gravel that sparkled with frost from the previous night's cold snap. The car's interior remained undisturbed, except for the absence of its owner, as if Cruz had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished into the mountain air. Rodriguez's flashlight beam swept across the sedan's interior, illuminating details that would haunt the subsequent investigation. Cruz's service weapon lay on the passenger seat, its leather holster empty and positioned as if placed there deliberately rather than dropped in haste. Her police radio sat silent on the dashboard, its battery indicator showing full power despite the unit's failure to respond to dispatch calls throughout the previous night. Personal items remained untouched in their usual locations, suggesting that whatever had happened to Cruz had occurred without struggle or signs of forced departure. The discovery of Cruz's badge presented the most disturbing element of the scene. The gold shield lay centered on the driver's seat, positioned with geometric precision that spoke to deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. The badge's surface reflected the morning light in harsh flashes that seemed to mock the authority it represented, while its placement suggested a message intended for those who would eventually find it. Rodriguez photographed the badge from multiple angles, documenting evidence that would eventually link Cruz's disappearance to a pattern of predation stretching back decades. Search teams deployed throughout the wilderness area with equipment and personnel that represented the largest law enforcement operation in the region's history. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the forest canopy, while ground teams followed every trail and stream bed within a 20-mile radius. Search dogs picked up Cruz's scent, leading away from the parking area but lost the trail completely after following it for less than half a mile, as if she had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands. The official search continued for 2 weeks, with volunteers joining law enforcement personnel in combing through terrain that ranged from accessible hiking trails to nearly impenetrable wilderness. The effort consumed thousands of man-hours and cost the county budget more than $50,000, but yielded no trace of Cruz beyond the evidence found in her abandoned vehicle. As days turned into weeks without discoveries, the search gradually scaled back until only a skeleton crew remained to investigate occasional false leads and citizen reports. Agent Thomas Harris arrived from Sacramento to personally oversee the federal investigation that paralleled local efforts, his face showing the strain of a man watching his worst fears materialize. The veteran FBI agent had spent 10 years haunted by the Thompson case, and Cruz's disappearance felt like a personal failure that cut deeper than any professional setback he had experienced. Harris established his command post in the same visitor center where he had coordinated the original Thompson search, surrounded by maps and photographs that documented a decade of frustrated investigation. The similarities between Cruz's disappearance and the Thompson case were too numerous to ignore, from the abandoned vehicle to the complete absence of struggle or obvious foul play. Harris spread crime scene photographs across his desk, comparing details between the two cases, while searching for patterns that might reveal the location where Cruz had been taken. The precision of evidence placement in both scenes suggested a perpetrator who understood law enforcement procedures and took pleasure in taunting investigators with carefully constructed mysteries. 3 weeks after Cruz's disappearance, a manila envelope arrived at the Tulare County Sheriff's Department addressed to Harris in block letters that revealed nothing about the sender's identity. The envelope contained no return address or postmark that might indicate its origin, having been delivered by private courier service that accepted cash payments and asked no questions about sender identification. Deputy Rodriguez opened the package with latex gloves, treating it as potential evidence while maintaining chain of custody procedures that might prove crucial in future prosecutions. Inside the envelope lay a single Polaroid photograph that made Rodriguez's hands shake with recognition and revulsion. The image showed Detective Cruz in what appeared to be one of the underground isolation chambers, her face displaying the hollow-eyed despair of someone who had been broken by prolonged psychological torture. She wore the same clothes found missing from her vehicle, but her appearance suggested weeks or months of captivity, rather than the brief period since her disappearance. The photograph bore the same composition and lighting characteristics as images recovered from the underground complex, confirming the connection between Cruz's fate and the horrors that had been perpetrated there. Harris examined the photograph under magnification, searching for details that might indicate the location where it had been taken or clues about Cruz's current condition. The stone walls visible in the background matched architectural features from the known underground complex, but subtle differences in construction technique suggested that the image might have been taken in a previously undiscovered chamber. The implications sent ice through Harris's veins as he realized that the facility they had investigated might represent only a fraction of the actual underground network. The discovery of the photograph triggered a new wave of investigation that brought additional federal resources to bear on what was now classified as an active kidnapping case. Forensic specialists analyzed every pixel of the image for hidden information, while behavioral analysts studied Cruz's expression and body language for signs of her psychological state. The technical examination revealed that the photograph had been taken with professional equipment under controlled lighting conditions, suggesting that Cruz's capture had been planned and executed with the same methodical precision that characterized previous crimes. Media attention intensified dramatically following the release of limited information about Cruz's disappearance and its connection to the Thompson case. Local television stations broadcast nightly updates on the investigation, while national news outlets picked up the story of a detective who had vanished while pursuing a decades-old cold case. The coverage attracted crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators who offered theories and assistance that complicated official efforts while generating hundreds of false leads that required precious resources to investigate. Among the media coverage, a true crime podcast called Vanished Without Trace dedicated a special episode to the Cruz disappearance, hosted by investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell, who had built a reputation for thorough research and compelling storytelling. Mitchell's melodious voice carried a gravity appropriate to the subject matter as she recounted the details of Cruz's investigation and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Her narration wove together facts from official sources with interviews of family members and colleagues who painted a picture of a dedicated officer who had sacrificed everything in pursuit of justice. Mitchell's podcast episode opened with atmospheric sound effects that placed listeners in the mountain wilderness where Cruz had vanished, complete with wind through pine trees and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Her voice emerged from this soundscape with practiced authority as she began the narrative that would captivate thousands of listeners worldwide. The episode structure followed Cruz's investigation chronologically, building tension through carefully paced revelations that culminated in her mysterious disappearance. The podcast recounted Agent Harris's decade-long obsession with the Thompson case, painting him as a tortured figure driven by professional pride and personal demons to pursue answers that seemed perpetually beyond his reach. Mitchell's research had uncovered details about Harris's background that explained his dedication to cold cases, including a childhood trauma involving his missing sister that had never been resolved. The parallel between his personal loss and professional frustrations added psychological depth to the narrative that resonated with listeners who understood the power of unresolved grief. Dr. Hoffman's geological expertise received detailed coverage in the podcast, with Mitchell explaining how technological advances had finally enabled the identification of the rock formation that had puzzled investigators for years. The segment included audio from an interview with Dr. Hoffman, her voice conveying the scientific excitement of discovery tempered by horror at the implications of what they had found. The geological explanation provided listeners with technical details that grounded the supernatural-seeming disappearances in physical reality, while maintaining the mysterious atmosphere that made the case so compelling. The podcast's treatment of Samuel Keller painted him as a monster, whose evil had metastasized beyond his individual actions to infect others with his twisted worldview. Mitchell's research had uncovered previously unreported details about Keller's background, including childhood trauma and early signs of psychological disturbance that might have predicted his later crimes if anyone had recognized their significance. The psychological profile that emerged suggested a methodical predator who had perfected his techniques through years of practice and refinement. David Collins received sympathetic treatment in the podcast, presented as a victim of circumstances who had been gradually corrupted through manipulation and fear until he became complicit in horrors that contradicted his fundamental nature. Mitchell's interview with Collins revealed additional details about his psychological state and the techniques that Keller had used to ensure his cooperation. The segment explored the complex moral questions surrounding victims who became perpetrators, examining the blurred lines between innocence and guilt that characterized the case. The podcast's climax focused on Cruz's investigation and disappearance, with Mitchell's voice dropping to near whisper as she described the detective's final known movements and the evidence found in her abandoned vehicle. Sound effects placed listeners in the forest darkness where Cruz had vanished, creating an immersive experience that made her fate feel personal and immediate. The absence of resolution in her case added to the episode's emotional impact, leaving listeners with the same sense of frustration and helplessness that plagued the official investigation. Mitchell concluded the episode with speculation about the ongoing threat represented by the case, suggesting that Cruz's disappearance indicated continued criminal activity by perpetrators who remained at large. Her voice carried warning as she advised listeners to exercise caution in wilderness areas and to trust their instincts if situations felt dangerous or unusual. The episode ended with contact information for law enforcement agencies and a request for listeners to report any information that might aid in the investigation. 6 months after Cruz's disappearance, routine maintenance at a remote fire station uncovered evidence that confirmed the worst fears of investigators who had never abandoned hope for her rescue. A wooden supply cache hidden beneath loose floorboards contained personal items that belonged to Cruz, including her watch and a photograph of her daughter that she carried in her wallet. The items were arranged with the same geometric precision that characterized evidence placement at previous crime scenes, suggesting that they had been positioned deliberately as another taunting message for investigators. The final scene of this dark saga played out in a newly constructed underground chamber that had been carved from bedrock with the same precision and attention to detail that characterized the original complex. The space showed improvements and refinements that reflected years of additional experience, with enhanced lighting systems, improved ventilation, and technological upgrades that made the facility more efficient and harder to detect. The chamber represented the evolution of evil, showing how systematic predation could adapt and improve through practice and learning. A figure moved through this new chamber with the calm precision of someone completely comfortable in his environment, adjusting equipment and preparing the space for its intended purpose. The man appeared unremarkable at first glance, with clean clothes and well-groomed appearance that would allow him to blend seamlessly into any social situation. His movements showed the controlled efficiency of someone who had performed similar tasks countless times, each gesture economical and purposeful. Only when the man turned toward the chamber's entrance did his identity become clear to any observer who might recognize him from decade-old photographs. Ethan Thompson's face had been refined by years of psychological transformation, until it reflected none of the warmth and humanity visible in his wedding pictures. His eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a creature that had abandoned human empathy in favor of something far more predatory and calculating. Thompson's preparations suggested that the chamber would soon receive new occupants, with restraint systems tested for security and photographic equipment positioned for optimal documentation of whatever would occur within the space. His methodical approach indicated complete confidence in his ability to continue operations indefinitely, secure in the knowledge that law enforcement efforts had failed to locate or stop him. The cycle of violence that had begun with Samuel Keller decades earlier showed no signs of ending, having found in Thompson a host who possessed the intelligence and skills necessary to refine and perpetuate the systematic destruction of human life. The forest above remained peaceful and beautiful, its ancient trees standing as silent witnesses to the horror that festered beneath their roots. Hikers and campers continued to visit the wilderness areas, drawn by the promise of natural beauty and outdoor adventure, unaware that predators moved among them with patience and precision honed through decades of successful hunting. The evil that had consumed Thompson and claimed crews continued to metastasize through the underground network, spreading like a cancer through the wilderness areas, where people sought solace and recreation. As Thompson completed his preparations and moved deeper into the tunnel system toward chambers that held secrets too dark for daylight to touch, the cycle that had defined his existence prepared to claim new victims. The detective who had dedicated her career to breaking that cycle had instead become its latest casualty, her sacrifice adding another layer of tragedy to a story that seemed destined to continue indefinitely. The forest would keep its secrets, and the darkness below would continue to hunger for the light and life of those who wandered too far from the safety of the known world. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.